So with port scanning, people probably think of network ports being like actual ports on a computer. When we're talking about network ports, it's not actually ports that are physical. They are things that are just associated with a certain service. So as you can see there on the key term, which is in your revision books if anybody ever gets them, um, it basically says that a port is something that is assigned to a service. So if you're using the internet and you're going on a website that uses HTTP, which you've probably seen before in a browser, it says HTTP. It's using that protocol to give you your web page. Um, that will be assigned to port 80 usually. So port 80 is just for hypertext transfer protocol to be run on. Obviously, there'll be different ports for different things. If you've ever been on a Xbox or PlayStation or PC trying to play a game and it says this port is blocked, it's probably because your network doesn't use that port for what your game is needing it for, because the game might need that port for a particular service, and by default your network will block it. So if you've ever had to open a port before, that's what that's talking about, because ports are used for specific um, services. So port 8 is usually used for HTTP. Um, TCP, when I've mentioned about IP previously before, TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, that is just a data packet that is attached to an IP address. So the TCP is literally just a data packet that is sent along with an IP address, so you can send data between two machines. That's all that means. So if you're thinking what's TCP, that's not been mentioned before. That's all it is. So yeah, so TCP/IP might be used with HTTP to find a web page and bring the data back, but obviously each one will use different port numbers. But with attacks, obviously you can scan ports, so potentially you could scan ports and see what different services are running. You might think, well, what's the point of that? I can see different services running. How is that any good to an attacker? But because they can see what things are running, they could basically exploit any vulnerabilities that is being used on your network system, because it could be that you're using a system that's really old, like an application that uses a port that you don't really know of, like say it's port 300 and something, and it's running a really old service. It might be that when they're scanning the ports, they see that and think, right, that's my way into the network. So port scanning is good at sort of detecting any services that are running that might have some vulnerabilities in it, essentially. Um, and along that vein, something called idle scanning. So, idle scanning is another form of port scanning, but another PC does the scanning for you. So the attacker is not doing the scanning. The attacker tells another PC to do the scanning, so the attacker basically can't be traced. Now, obviously, they can technically be traced depending on uh, how they've set their scan up, but usually it makes it more difficult for an attacker to be traced back, because they're using something called a zombie PC, and I'm not kidding, it is called a zombie PC. Um, Basically, it means that it's a PC that's been compromised by an attacker. So it means that they've taken over that PC, and they can control it, and obviously they're using that to scan ports. That's why it's called a zombie, essentially, because somebody else is controlling it. It's not doing what it should do. Um, and again, obviously, because they're using that PC, there's very little chance that you can trace back to the tracker. Obviously, there is a little bit of a chance, but it's more safe than just doing normal port scanning. So that is basically what port and idle scanning threat is. Obviously, they're passive, so they don't affect your network, but um, you can see vulnerabilities in your network. It doesn't take advantage of them. It just looks at them and looks for them rather than taking advantage of them. So um, that's why it's considered a passive threat.